I stand here alone with my head in my hands. Been gone so long, I can't remember where I've been. I'm thinking about back at home, my family and friends. My brothers don't know that I'm there till the end. It's one thing that we all know. It's one thing we all know. No man's left behind. You'll see me once, you'll see me twice. I fight alongside my brothers. There's no man is left behind.
How do you determine whether an animal has PTSD?
Very much like we do with humans. In the case of a diagnosis for PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot is known already if you know the circumstances that an individual has experienced. So, for example, this would be someone who would be a veteran who's experienced, obviously, a lot of violence and trauma, either personally or vicariously. And the same thing with, like, for example, an elephant. So if you have an elephant who has been captured and brought into captivity from the wild, and the circumstances, which in this particular case for elephants, is that they have witnessed their family killed, they have been prematurely weaned, meaning they've stopped nursing sooner than they do normally, they have been separated from their family, they've been transported, and now they're in captivity. So PTSD is a constellation of diagnoses, now complex PTSD, etc., that is basically informed by external knowledge of what that individual has experienced. So the same thing goes with a human as with an elephant, a bear, or a dog.
The procedure to treat an animal with PTSD, say an elephant?
Well, it will vary with the species and the situation, which is similar to humans, depending on the age, etc. In the case of the elephant, we'll start with that. The first thing, as in all trauma recovery, is to remove the individual or buffer the individual from the stressor, a proximal stressor. So with trauma, that's something that has quote unquote happened in the past. But in cases of like complex PTSD, CPTSD, it may be chronic in the sense of when the elephant is in captivity. So the first thing you would do with, say, an elephant in a zoo or a circus is to take them away from that, the depauperate, the very poor conditions that captivity has, into an area which is feeling safe. You know, that's one of the first things, is to create a safe container. So in the case of elephants, that's bringing them to sanctuary, where the conditions there are, there's still captivity, but the sanctuary professionals draw from, in the sense of a safe container, a healthful environment, social, psychological, security, etc. And then there's no triggers. So you're trying to remove the kinds of triggers that might actually send that person back into their past where the trauma occurred. Now, in the case of elephants in what they call countries of origin, so for example, in Kenya, Dame Daphne Sheldrick of the David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust has been taking in orphaned elephants for 50, 60 years. And in those particular cases, she is able to go through the trauma recovery for a child, in the sense of that the elephant is brought up into an normal elephant kind of environment, and then eventually reintroduced.
Do you think that PTSD can be hereditary?
The mechanisms that are involved in creating PTSD is a diagnosis. So it basically identifies a cluster or a constellation of symptoms, and then with knowledge that that individual has experienced something that is traumatic. So PTSD itself can't be inherited in that way, but the causes of PTSD, meaning in the sense of, or I should say the medium, which is stress and trauma, which perpetuate and transmit across generations, both neurobiologically and socially, in the way, for example, a mother raises her baby, or a family that has experienced trauma is raising the baby. That's socially. So neurobiologically and socially, stress and trauma transmit. So from that perspective, then the infant, whether it's a chicken or it's any other kind of bird, like an Amazon parrot, a bear, dog, wolf, whatever, whoever that is, then through the transmission, through neurobiological and social transmission, that individual can have a susceptibility to post-traumatic stress. So a lot can be done in the formative early stages of attachment, to basically, if the child is raised in a way that is very healthful, very supportive, what they call pro-social, a lot of nurturing, a lot of really positive attunement between the caregiver and the infant, then the stress transmission can be somehow ameliorated or attenuated in some kind of fashion.
So with that in mind, are you able to determine the triggers for each animal? Are you able to, or is that something that comes with time?
In a lot of occasions, I would say probably the majority of occasions with an animal, for example, a cat or a dog or a rabbit, that comes into a human home, you don't necessarily know a lot about their experiences in their past. Sanctuaries and rescue groups, for example, a parrot sanctuary that I worked with, they had cockatoos, they had macaws, Amazons, and most of the time they really didn't know where they came from. They were just either relinquished or they were rescued. In the case of a cat or a dog, you look at their symptoms. You listen to them, and you watch, and you see things that make them anxious and that might make them fearful, or that make them withdraw, those kinds of symptoms. And then you can try to kind of put together what those things might be. For example, I had a cat that I rescued, and she lived with me for many years. And she was very secure, very assured after a while. And I noticed, though, that she always would get very terrified when she heard a paper bag, being opened, or a plastic bag, or something like that kind of sound. And so I would not do that in front of her. And I didn't know why, but I just, that was something that upset her. And I found out, I actually, by chance, met her former guardian who had relinquished her. And she had told me that she had, as a young cat, someone had stuffed her into a bag and put her in a closet for 3 to 4 days. So I can't say it, but it's a pretty strong correlation that the reason why she didn't like those sounds is because it triggered her traumatic memory. And then the other thing is that when we don't necessarily know what those triggers are, but there's ways of anticipating or somehow decreasing the possibility of triggering something, and that is to lower, essentially, think of like a bathtub letting the water out, lowering the potentiality of stress and anxiety in the environment in which the individual is living. And so that takes, paying attention to tuning into your cat, your rabbit, and then paying attention to know that when there are, could be, something distal, something that's not related, but when there's anxiety, whether it's you yourself or whether there's something happening on the outside, firecrackers, those kinds of things increase the tension in the overall atmosphere. And essentially what that does is it lowers the threshold and that trigger can actually happen. Even if, for example, that particular thing, like let's say it's a firecracker. In the case of my feline, it wasn't necessarily a firecracker that caused the trauma, but because it was something that increases her anxiety, then that increases the probability that she may have a flashback in that sense. So being self-aware is really important because then you know what you're bringing in to the atmosphere and the environment of that animal. And most animals, whether they're domesticated or wild, well, domesticated, I'll put it that way, or even wildlife, is they are less in control of their environment than we are. So it's a very important thing to understand, you know, and to develop practices of self-awareness and ways in terms of tuning into your emotions and dissipating them before, for example, maybe having an interaction with your dog or cat.
I would wish that more humans would be self-aware in the first place, but when it comes right down to it, we're barely aware of our surroundings, let alone ourselves. And when we do get to that point, it seems that, you know, now we're self-aware, but we're also self-involved, which is hard to separate for some. So
I think that's really an important point, is that the way our most of our lives are, it's very fast, it's very filled with a lot of different things. There's not a lot of value given to what we would call downtime, processing. If someone has experienced something like the loss of, you know, or grief of any kind, and we're bombarded, if it's not our personal grief, we're bombarded with what we hear and we experience and see in other individuals, in the environment, and the earth, and everything. And very, very little time is really given to the length of time, the processes. It's not just snap. There's ups, there's downs. It's coming into relationship with this new, you know, reality of whether you've lost your spouse or you've had some kind of trauma event or you hear about something. And so we get disconnected and dissociated. And that's when we start to, you know, increase, sort of boomerang up the stress and the anxiety. So I think it's the essential thing in our society to cultivate are these practices of self-awareness. You know, are these practices, and in the language and models of trauma and psychology, we're talking about self-regulation, affect regulation, emotional regulation, stress regulation, ways of essentially helping us self-tune so we don't become reactive. Because when we just emote, which is fine if it's appropriate, you know, if for example, that's not, you know, you have to be conscious of the other person. You know, obviously with your family and friends and stuff, you know, then you develop kind of a rhythm of what's acceptable and what's not and what's timely. But the way our society is wired is very reactive. It's very, you know, and there's not a big enough container which is provided for an individual to really work through his or her emotions.
it occurred to me maybe 3 or 4 years ago that I can choose whether or not I want to be involved in somebody else's, I'll say, consciousness or field of thought. So if they come to me and they're very upset, I can say, no, I don't have time, or whatever is appropriate, and keep that field in their world instead of inviting it into mine. And then I have to take on whatever it is they're doing or thinking or acting on. That's very freeing. We all live in a field, as you say, so if I'm able to do that, is that something new, or is that something that, I'm almost divorcing myself from their world, their consciousness?
Well, I think that there's ways and there's ways. Again, I think you have to look right now, because essentially there's an awareness now of our culture is fundamentally traumatogenic, meaning it causes trauma.
Right.
There's very little in our society, in our personal relationships, in our larger social relationships, community relationships, on. There's very little space that's given, again, to really addressing this fundamental sense of trauma that's going on. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, then everyone becomes like a cup overflowing, So we're really at the point of understanding that our culture at a fundamental level has to change. So there are some things, you know, if you look at tribal and traditional families, if you look in wildlife, is that there's space and there's time. And space and time where there is attunement and cohesion, social, psychological cohesion and attunement, then these kinds of things can be accommodated. The problem is that we typically have very fractured, or often fractured kinds of situations. So when something occurs to you, it's really, or me, it's really important. I need to do something. Oftentimes, it's not available to me. So that's what we're really at in the society is we're starting to rebuild in social resilience, trying to make things more diffuse, build trust. We've had tremendous psychological and social betrayal, where there isn't a fundamental trust anymore. Joni Mitchell has this great song, and she has a line that says, I bump against a stranger, we both apologize. I mean, to me, that's really an indictment.
Yeah.
The first thing with humans is prevent trauma. So, for example, that means, we'll go back to our elephant example where I've studied that extensively, but it holds for all other animals. Stop shooting them, stop translocating them, stop capturing and bringing them into zoos. All of those things are traumatogenic. Stop violence against animals, because that's a fundamental trauma stressor. And so there's that. The same thing that goes, for example, with domesticated animals, to stop exploiting them. And again, although people might roll their eyes and say, well, those are animals and they don't have the feelings, the point is that science, now somewhat openly, although science has been reluctant to admit, in neurosciences, it says explicitly that all animals, all vertebrates, including invertebrates like an octopus, have the brain, the emotions, the mind, and experience consciousness comparable to us. They have the brain structures and processes that we do that govern cognition, feeling, and consciousness. So for an animal, the first thing is trauma prevention. So, the same thing with human, don't cause trauma. So essentially, those are the kinds of things that we're really looking at as a society, is rebuilding our sense of self from a relational perspective, building in capacity, building in resilience, and ways of living that allows us, we would say, to be human. It would allow us to reach out to each other and say, this is a difficult situation. Let's wait can you just give me a few minutes? That can be sometimes fine, just for you maybe to leave the room, take a breath and say, okay, I'm here for you. Oh, do you see what I mean? So, and even before that incident, doing what we mentioned before, self-awareness, self-care, so that when something does occur and you are called upon to witness for someone, to be there for someone, whether it's your dog or your cat or your parrot or whatever, then you can be present, and vice versa in that way.
My PTSD has improved
Yeah.
mostly because of awareness and that kind of thing, and society is absent of that for the most part anymore.
Well, that's building in. I mean, in other words, there's different components. So you've been in the model of like John Bowlby, who was a British psychologist, and Mary Ainsworth, who was his colleague, and it's called attachment theory. There's been neuropsychology that's now been added to that, Alan Shore at UCLA, where we're looking at how these early relationships and attachment with a baby, a chick, and the mommy, it's called a secure attachment. You have that attunement, and that's stress regulation in the brain. So this secure attachment then is a way of helping you calibrate, learn as a baby how to calibrate to what you're going to expect in the environment as you grow older. So again, this ties into the PTSD in the sense of the statement of that PTSD is a natural response to unnatural conditions. So one thing that's very key then is needing for us as a society to change normal, what's considered normal, which is traumatogenic, to work on getting rid of those kinds of ways of being and seeing and living that really are traumatogenic and cause a lot of stress. So that immediately then gives space. And so that individual then is coming into an environment, is learning how to be kind, is learning how to have space, self-confidence, self-competence, meaning you have certainty, that you're able to do things and be centered, etc. So that's really important, because then you're not, that individual is tuning in to an expectation of a society that truly matches his or her way of growing up. Certain species will be more sensitive to certain kinds of stressors than others. But the reality is, beyond a certain level and kind and duration and magnitude of a stressor, we all will collapse. We will all feel trauma in that way.
What do you feel is one of the bigger issues with animals and PTSD?
I would say that one of the biggest issues is human awareness, or lack of awareness and appreciation that animals are susceptible to trauma, and understand how that manifests and be sympathetic to it. I guess that was like several things, but that's basically awareness. And as with humans, it's trauma awareness, PTSD awareness. And with that awareness then comes an appreciation for what PTSD actually entails.
What do you believe animals can teach us about ourselves with or without PTSD?
I think in general, I mean, we're at the point now where we talk about animals, but that's because they're quote unquote not human. But we're really at the point where we can start talking about individuals and species, just like we do with humans. And I think that's very important. Generally speaking, though, animals, non-human animals, have, I think what the best way to call it is, they are much more accepting. And I would say accepting not in the sense of condoning or resigning, but they're very present, and they are very tuned into the present and valuing the present. And in that way, they're very accepting. We experience that, people say, my dog doesn't care what I look like, if I've got curlers or whatever, I look like hell in the morning, they're very unconditional love. And I think it's important to think about unconditional love in the sense of they are very accepting. The unconditionality is really important, but we can't take advantage of that. So I think they teach us self-restraint, self-care, self-respect, and a profound respect for other life. I think that's probably the most important thing that other animals teach us, is they are extremely respectful of other life, including humans. And I think we take advantage of that, and we don't appreciate that. There's a lot of animals that, that this is where you see, for example, parrots. You see it in dogs, you see it in rabbits. They have symptoms of complex PTSD. They self-mutilate, in the case of parrots, to the point of where it's called suicide, when they lose their human guardian or one of their mates is lost. They have anxiety, they have hypervigilance, hyperaggression, profound depression, inappetence, they don't want to eat. So a lot of animals, although they accept that even they cannot cope with the kinds of things that people do to them, humans do to them. Yeah. I'll give you a story of an orca. Orcas are killer whales, the black and white whales. And it's really unusual that they're very powerful. They have big teeth, and through all of human history, and this goes for thousands of years because they've lived next to the native peoples up in the Northwest, in North America, all over the world, in the South Pacific, etc., and they have never ever harmed a human, ever. Wow. So it's been kind of astounding because researchers say, well, why not? And so they have a very, very traditional, they're very insular society. And it's just a fact. Even in the cases where there's been roundups, where there's boats and planes, and they circle around and they take the baby orcas away from their families. And there's witnesses that talk about, even though the adults are outside the nets and they watch and they hear the screams of the baby, but they could easily break through, they could easily, knock over a boat, etc., but they don't. So what does that mean? I think one way to look at it is that they have a taboo. For whatever reason, there's a taboo against harming humans. And, we have an orca like Tilikum who was captured as a baby and brought into an aquarium, and he killed 3 people. And I think we can look at that incident as, obviously, he lives basically in a large bathtub relative to his size, in isolation, has to do shows, etc. And I think when you talk to orca people, they pretty much agree that for him to break that profound taboo was, essentially banishing himself from his society. Not that he, I mean, in the sense of that he's giving up everything inside, his identity, his profound identity. And when I heard about that and I looked at it from the perspective of that, I talked about the cultural taboo, etc., that was very upsetting to think that life was so bad for him in this kind of condition in an aquarium that he basically, in a sense, self-immolated. In other words, he knew he could never go back, in a sense, to the orca society. So from that perspective, I think we really need to appreciate that, as I said, that the tolerance of animals can't be taken advantage of. They have vast psyches, they have vast capacities to renew, to forgive, to trust, etc. But at the same time, I think we have misinterpreted that as they can absorb anything and they'll be fine. And so that's why you have epidemic PTSD in free-living elephants. You have epidemic PTSD in zoo and circus animals, lions, tigers, even reptiles have that. So coyotes, wolves, bears, when there's hunting, mass hunting, that is genocide. So again, looking from the neuropsychological, it's not anthropomorphism, it's very consistent with science that they have the same brain and mind and sensibilities and sensitivities and vulnerabilities to trauma, the loss of their baby, the loss of their family and society. And we are essentially, wreaking havoc in terms of their lives. What are the things that we can do to learn? The learning is how violent we are, how reckless we are. And we can see that in our own relationships and the way we promulgate trauma in the wars and the violence that we perpetuate. So our society, modern society as such, over the last few hundred years, has been working on a model of violence as a solution, or genocide as a solution. You have a problem, kill it. I mean, that's really not an exaggeration. So I think that we have to understand that even though, quote unquote, the orcas and the white sharks and the grizzly bears and the rattlesnakes, these are predators supposedly, but they use their strength, their venom, whatever, their power in a very parsimonious way. And that's a real lesson for us and a model. Primarily, the first thing I've done is working on my self-awareness. We would call it self-care for, affect, stress, basically being mindful, keeping an eye on myself, my reaction, my influence on others, keeping healthful so that I work within my capacity that doesn't spill over into other people in an inappropriate way. Listening, that's another thing, is cultivating listening skills. Not listening for what I want to hear, but listening to what I hear. This goes to other people, humans, and it goes also to the animals that I live with, the wildlife that are in our neighborhood, the animals that we rescue in our sanctuary, and not being judgmental, that's a third thing. Withholding judgment, in the sense of we do have to make decisions, which is in itself a kind of a judgment, but it doesn't have to get into a blame thing. We can still retain our respect and for another being. We may not like what they say or do or think, but we can still retain our respect. We still can retain our understanding that we're very interconnected. And then another thing that I think is important, or what I've learned, is we don't know the whole picture.
Have we cut ourselves off from the natural feedback and instincts that we have always sought to contain? Sure.
But I think in general, yes. We are the only species that we're aware of that commits the excesses the way we have. For whatever reason, I mean, there's a lot of different theories of why that is, but I think that's less important, and what is more important is how do we want to be? So when people have PTSD and they're in recovery, often they find going into nature quite soothing, quite healing, quite centering. And I think there's a reason for that. So I think that's natural impetus, that someone who has been injured is seeking healing, and that's the response to it. And I think that's a really profound sign, to say, wow, let's go that way. Let's be like nature. Well, I think one of the most difficult things that people say is, well, how do you reconnect with nature? Well, we are connected.
Right.
So it's not so much connecting with nature, but improving the quality of our connection. How do we enhance the quality of our relationship, the quality of our connection with non-human nature? And I think that needs to be the focus in that way. You know, we've become a self-hating species, or at least part of us have. I don't think everyone feels that way, but I do think in this kind of modern technological, world, so it's a tough road. But I don't think that's constructive. I think
Right.
I think the energy needs to be directed toward how do we foster something positive? How do I want to be as a human, as a being? How do I want to be in the world? There's a tremendous sense of contentment that derives from that, not complacency, not sort of a, what's the word for it, smugness. There's nothing about that. There's a great joy and wonderful feelings of contentment, of being able to see things and hear things and be with, other animals that is very desirable. And I think it's very possible to do that with other people. For example, I'm writing a book with a man named Charlie Russell. Charlie's in his 70s. He's lived his entire life in Canada with grizzly bears. And he spent 10 years in Siberia in Russia, rehabilitating orphaned grizzly bears, they call them brown bears there, into the wild. And he had to become a grizzly bear mama. Wow. So what was important with Charlie, it's not just what he knew, because he observed for years and years and years, but who he became. And he became a grizzly mother. And he was successful because he was able to model with them, just like we talk with attachment. He was able to teach them, again, we're talking about two little brains talking to each other, tuning the bear brain at its own as a bear, so that they were able to live with other bears and be successful being a bear. And so Charlie is an exemplar of how we can be. I think we get too hung up on the outside. Again, that was a point I wanted to make, is start to see beyond form. Where, Algie's wearing a dog suit. No, you're wearing a human suit. I'm wearing a human suit. Sophia, one of our rabbits, is wearing a rabbit suit. And really see beyond, or if you encounter someone, see beyond form. Try to see beyond form. And that, of course, relates back to the whole notion of judgment. Don't go, oh, you're a blank, therefore. And I think if we do that, that's what nature does. Nature really sees beyond form. And when they've stopped, which there's, for example, deer who know me very well, they're still wise because they're hunted every year after year after year after year. So we have stress transmission, trauma transmission that has occurred. And it's broken the bond. And so, for example, if you talk to a mentor of mine, Vine Deloria, Sioux Indian, his grandfather was a buffalo speaker, very famous. And they would talk. And he knew they lived together like this, just like Charlie and the bears. They know how to live together. Wow. They live with respecting each other and seeing beyond form. So we can become individuals and a society that we like. And I guess that's what I'm saying. What can we do to start liking ourselves personally, as well as the people that we encounter? How do we make ourselves into humans that we like? I think we know those things. And it takes a lot of, for some people more than others, myself, you have to be patient and you have to work hard at refraining. And, for me personally, there's certain things where I've really had to consciously change how I'm wired. It wasn't necessarily bad, but there were things I needed to change that would, not tick people off, or, being self-aware of how I was coming across. Just because my intentions were good didn't mean necessarily they were received good, So in that sense of being, that's where, our identification with the ego has to change in that sense. Lee Birkins is a Vietnam vet who has written extensively, and he's a Qigong master. These are things that he speaks about and he writes about and practices. And these are, again, exemplars. These are stellar individuals who happen to be human, and they're phenomenal. So we have examples of how to be a human in a way that we care for and that we want to model.